This CACFP meal pattern webinar on using the grains flowchart was presented on March 6, 2019 to a center sponsor audience. The version you're currently viewing has been edited and shortened from the original.
Hello, and welcome to the Meal Pattern Success webinar on using the grains flowchart. My name is Darcy Miller, and I'll be presenting the webinar today. I'm joined by Dee Dee Pointer. Before we get started, since this is a webinar, all microphones are muted, but we will be accepting questions through the Questions tab of your navigation panel. At the end of the session, we'll have a few minutes to answer any questions you might have. Questions you submit will be answered at that time. If you're new to CACFP, we strongly recommend either reviewing the CACFP Policy and Procedure Manual, Chapter 8, section on grains, or by going to YouTube and watching the CACFP meal pattern training on the child and adult care meal patterns for grains first. This is because this half-hour webinar will not have enough time to review all aspects of the grains component in detail, and this webinar may be confusing if you do not understand some of the basics of the grains component. Instead, this training will quickly go over some definitions and then spend most of the time looking at examples and going through the different steps in the flowchart for credible and whole grain rich grains. At the end, we'll briefly go over a few additional grains resources that are also available and may help in determining whether your grains are credible and or whole grain rich. Let's get into crediting grains first. All grains that are served must be credible. This means that at any time you serve a grain, it has to be a grain that meets the guidelines for being a creditable grain in CACFP. In addition to that, however, at least once per day, you must also serve a whole grain rich grain. Whole grain rich items are creditable, but not all creditable grains will be whole grain rich. This means if you're serving 3 grain items in 2 meals and 1 snack over 1 day, all 3 items must be creditable, but only 1 of those items will need to be whole grain rich. First, let's review what makes a creditable grain creditable. A creditable grain is one of the following: whole grain meals and flours, enriched grains, bran or germ. Whole grains are grains that have the bran, germ, and endosperm, while enriched grains are grains that have had the bran and the germ removed, but have had vitamins and minerals added back in. Fortified breakfast cereals are also considered credible grains. As long as breakfast cereals are fortified with vitamins and minerals and it meets the sugar limits, it will be creditable. Make sure that all of your grain products are creditable before serving it as part of a reimbursable meal or snack. On the flip side, there are other grains that are not creditable. These non-credible grains include grains that are not enriched nor whole grain. These non-credible grains are processed so that they remove all of the bran and germ, but do not include any added vitamins and minerals to make up the nutrients lost. Common non-enriched and non-credible items include white rice, farina, non-enriched pasta, and non-enriched cornmeal. Non-credible grains also include grain-based desserts, such as granola bars, cereal bars, cakes, cookies, and toaster pastries. It also includes breakfast cereals with sugar content higher than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce. In addition to credible and non-credible grains, you have another category called disregarded grain ingredients. These do not need to be counted at all when you're figuring out whether a grain product is creditable or not. Disregarded grains include grain derivatives, which are byproducts of grains, such as cornstarch or modified food starch. Disregarded grains also include non-credible grain ingredients that make up less than 2% of a product's weight. Disregarded grains will be a factor when we talk about the rule of 3 later. Remember earlier that we mentioned whole grain rich items must be served at least once a day. What does it mean to be whole grain rich? A whole grain rich item is a grain product that contains at least 50% whole grains, and the remaining grains within the food are enriched. There are 6 different methods of determining if an item is whole grain rich. They include any whole grain items listed on any state agency's WIC whole grains food list, having a product labeled as whole wheat with an FDA standard of identity, having a product with an FDA approved whole grain health claim on its packaging, meeting the whole grain rich requirements under the National School Lunch Program, having proper documentation from a manufacturer or a standardized recipe showing whole grains are the primary grains by weight for a grain item, and finally, meeting the rule of 3. An item only needs to meet the standards for one of the 6 methods of crediting whole grain rich. If you would like a more in-depth explanation of the 6 methods, please review the Grains YouTube video linked from the CACFP training page mentioned earlier. Generally, it's pretty easy to tell if your item is creditable and/or whole grain rich. Sometimes, though, it can be a good idea to double check. The handout you see on the screen is the back page of the grains flowchart. It's also known as the flowchart for determining creditable and whole grain rich grains. You saw the back page on our previous slide. The first page of the handout shows the step 1 flowchart, which is the step-by-step flowchart that helps you determine if the item is creditable or not. Remember, if it's not creditable, you won't be able to use it for any CACFP meals and snacks. If it is creditable, you can move on to the second and third page, which has the step 2 flowchart and will help you determine if your item is also whole grain rich. Let's take a look at a few grain examples that may be served throughout the day. You have Lucky Charms being served for breakfast, a whole grain rotini pasta for lunch, and Ritz crackers for afternoon snack. Let's say you're not sure if these items are creditable or whole grain rich, so we'll use our flowcharts to help make the determination. If you're not sure if your item is creditable or whole grain rich, make it a habit to check if your item is creditable first by using step 1 of the flowchart. First, let's look at Lucky Charms. Is it creditable? We'll start at the top left where there's the Start Here box. The first question is the grain product a grain-based dessert? If you're not sure, take a look at Exhibit A. Exhibit A has a list of grain items, and any item listed in red color font is considered a grain-based dessert. The answer is no, cereals are not grain-based desserts. So we'll move on to B1. Is the grain product a breakfast cereal? The answer is yes. Going down the chart, let's see the next question, B2. Is this an Oregon WIC cereal or a cereal which meets the sugar limit requirements of 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce? Let's pull up the WIC cereal list. Is it on there? No, it's not. This means that we need to look at the nutrition facts label for Lucky Charms. To do that, you need to look for the serving size, which is 27 grams, and the total sugars, which is 10 grams. Compare this with the serving size and sugar on your CACFP sugar limit card. The sugar limit for a cereal whose serving size is between 26 and 30 grams is 6 grams. So at 10 grams of sugar per serving size of 27 grams, Lucky Charms exceeds the sugar limit. This means that it doesn't meet the sugar limit requirement, so you'll say no to the B2. We'll follow our arrow down to the not creditable box. Since Lucky Charms is not a creditable grain, you won't be able to serve it because it won't be reimbursable. let's look for another option. If you wanted to serve a creditable cereal for that meal, an easy way to find a cereal meeting the sugar limit requirements is to look at the Oregon WIC cereal list and to choose one of the cereals there. For example, Corn Chex would meet the sugar limit requirements because it's on the WIC cereal list. Occasionally, you'll find that items you were planning on serving on your menu might not be creditable or whole grain rich. This is why it's always a good idea to double check your menu before you serve it. Any meals or snacks include non-creditable components after it's been served must be disallowed. Looking at the Corn Chex, we know it meets the sugar limit requirements, but let's quickly run through the step 1 credible flowchart again. First, we'll start at the top left where there's the Start Here box. The first question is the grain product a grain-based dessert? Again, the answer is no. So we'll move on to B1. Is the grain product a breakfast cereal? Yes, it is. Going down the chart, let's see the next question, B2. Is this an Oregon WIC cereal or a cereal which meets the sugar limit requirements of 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce? Yes, we saw it there a few moments ago. So yes, next, let's go to B3. Is the cereal fortified with vitamins and minerals? Here is the ingredient list. Do you see the vitamins and minerals? Yes, so we go down to yes. And we can be sure that this is a creditable item. Remember, even if a cereal meets the sugar limit requirements, it must also be fortified. If it is not fortified, you will also need to check the ingredient list to see if the first ingredient is enriched or whole grain before ensuring that it is creditable. So Corn Chex is creditable. Let's check to see if it's also whole grain rich using step 2 of the flowchart. Start again at the top left where it says Start Here. Question A, is this grain product on the Oregon WIC approved whole grain food list, or is it a breakfast cereal marked with a W on the Oregon WIC cereal list? Let's pull up the Oregon WIC cereal list again. Remember that not all WIC cereals are whole grain rich. Only the ones with a purple circle with a W inside are whole grain rich. So this one doesn't have that W circle. We'll say no. This takes us to box B. Does the grain product include one of the FDA approved whole grain health claims? You can see the claims in the light blue box in the middle. So the answer is no. And if you're ever unsure whether the answer is yes or no, always go with no and try to figure that out with another method you can use instead. Now we'll move down to box C. Does the grain product meet the whole grain rich criteria under National School Lunch Program? For most of us, the answer will be no, unless we're a school district or vended from one, so no. Next, we're moving down to box D. Is this a bread or pasta product? Right away, we know it's no. Now on to box E. Is there proper documentation from the manufacturer or a standardized recipe demonstrating that the whole grains are the primary grain by weight? Unless you wrote to General Mills, probably not, so no again. Now we're moving up with the arrows and going to box F1. This is the rule of 3, and all questions after this will be related to the rule of 3. Looking at the ingredient list, is the first ingredient or second after water a whole grain? Let's pull up that ingredient list again. What do you think? Yes, it's whole grain corn. So we'll say yes. This moves us to box F2. Is this a fortified breakfast cereal? take a look at the ingredient list again. Yes. So we'll move to the yes box and go to this grain product is whole grain rich. Once you reach the wheat icon, you know that your item is whole grain rich. This item is both creditable and whole grain rich. While Corn Chex may not be listed as a whole grain rich item on the WIC list, remember that it only needs to meet one method out of the 6 methods to be considered whole grain rich. Now let's look at another example. We have whole grain rotini pasta. Let's figure out first if it's creditable. So we'll start where it says start here for the step 1 flowchart. Is this a grain-based dessert? No. The next box, is this a breakfast cereal? No. Follow that arrow to the right to C1. Is the grain product labeled as whole grain or enriched? Yes, you can see that it is, where it says whole grain. Your answer is yes. Once you say yes, you'll follow that arrow all the way down to the bottom to creditable. This item is creditable. Now let's figure out if it's also whole grain rich using our step 2 flowchart. We'll start with our first question on top. Is this item on the Oregon WIC whole grains food list, or is it a breakfast cereal with a W? Let's check out the WIC whole grains food list. And since it's hard to see, we'll make the whole grain pasta section bigger. Do you see the Barilla whole grain rotini on the list? Yes, it's there. So we'll say yes to this question, and just like that, you'll see that your item is whole grain rich. If you keep going down the list, you'll see that this pasta will meet a few more methods of determining whole grain rich. This product only needs to meet one method though, so you're all set with this example. This item is both creditable and whole grain rich. Let's see if the Ritz crackers are also creditable using our step 1 flowchart. Start with box A. Is this a grain-based dessert? Nope. Savory crackers are not. Next question. Is this a breakfast cereal? No again. Next question. Is it labeled as whole grain or enriched? Yes, it says whole wheat and whole grain on the packaging. Now we'll follow the arrow and move down the page to where it says creditable on the bottom. The Ritz crackers are a creditable grain. Next, we'll see if it's also whole grain rich. We'll start with box A. Is this a grain product on the WIC whole grain list or a WIC cereal with a W? Let's pull up the WIC whole cereal list. It's hard to read here, but the answer is no. So we'll follow the arrow to no. Then we'll go down to box B. Does the grain product include an FDA-approved whole grain health claim? If you're familiar with the Ritz cracker box like I am, then you'll know the answer is no. So we'll try the next method. Does it meet the whole grain rich criteria under the National School Lunch Program? Remember that you're likely going to say no unless you're a school district and have documentation showing it is, so no. Next, we'll go down the page to box D. Is this a bread or pasta? No. Going on to box E. Is there a CN label or product formulation statement for this item? Likely not, so no. Let's get into the rule of 3 now. Is the first ingredient or second after water a whole grain? Here's the ingredient list. What is the first ingredient? Unbleached enriched flour. Is that a whole grain? Nope, it is not. We'll follow that no arrow and it heads to this grain product is not whole grain rich. This makes sense if you think about the definition of whole grain rich, that at least half of the grains must be whole grains, and the way ingredient labels work is that the ingredients that make up the most of the product are listed first, and then in descending order until you get to the smallest ingredient by percentage. So if the first ingredient is not a whole grain, whole grains likely won't make up 50% of the grain ingredients. Although we didn't get to the rest of the flow chart on the rule of 3, if you needed to look at the second or third grain ingredients to make a determination of whether it's whole grain rich or not, you'll see the questions regarding the disregarded grains that we discussed earlier. If you need help with disregarded grains, we have a tip box. We have tip boxes in blue on the flow chart handout that will give you a definition and some examples you may find helpful. So, Ritz crackers is not whole grain rich, but it is still a creditable grain item. Here are our 3 final examples. Both Corn Chex and the pasta are creditable and whole grain rich, while the Ritz crackers are only creditable. We will not serve the Lucky Charms. If we serve these 3 items for breakfast, lunch, and snack as the grain and components for each meal, would all of the meals and snacks be creditable for the grain component? And the answer would be yes. This is because you have 2 whole grain rich products and the third item is creditable. You only need to have 1 whole grain rich item per day, although having more is always a best practice. In addition to the grain flow chart, we also looked at a few other grain resources today that will help you determine if your grain item is creditable or whole grain rich. This included Exhibit A, which helped us determine if an item is a grain-based dessert. The CACFP sugar limit wallet card, which helped us figure out if our cereals met the sugar limit requirement. Finally, we have the Oregon WIC breakfast cereal and whole grain food list, which helped us determine if the items we had were creditable and whole grain rich. You can find all of these resources at our website under the CACFP meal pattern and menu planning page. In review, during our webinar today, we looked at definitions for grains, we looked at 4 different examples and determined if they were creditable and whole grain rich using the flow charts, and we looked at a few additional resources that helped us to make those determinations. Thank you all for all you do to feed Oregon. Have a great day.